Snow drove sideways through the night, rattling the shutters and clawing at the cracks of Elias Mercer's cabin. He sat where he always did, in the old rocking chair that had worn grooves into the pine boards, his rifle leaning close at hand, the fire spitting resin in the hearth. He had grown used to silence, to the rhythm of wind against wood and the hiss of burning logs. It was a silence that no longer comforted, but it was one he understood. When the knock came, it felt foreign, too light for a man's fist, too insistent for a wanderer lost in the storm. Elias set his jaw, pushed himself to his feet, and pulled the door open against the wind. There she stood. A woman, shawl heavy with snow, dark hair plastered against her cheeks. At her side, 2 children clung to her skirts, 1 girl, 1 boy, both hollow-eyed and trembling, their breaths fogging in the lantern light. She looked at him as if she had walked farther than she could bear, her voice breaking low and urgent. "Be the father my children need," she whispered, her lips pale from cold, "and I will be yours tonight." Her words seemed to hang in the icy air, daring him to slam the door. Elias's eyes shifted past her, out into the snowfield stretching endless and merciless, before returning to the faces before him. The children avoided his gaze, their boots sinking into the drift piling against his step. He said nothing. His silence stretched until even the fire behind him seemed to falter. He looked instead at the puddle beginning to form beneath their feet, at the snow sliding from her shawl, at the desperation she was too proud to hide. Finally, Elias stepped back. "Get in," he muttered, his voice rough as gravel. The woman ushered her children inside. The cabin, built for one, suddenly seemed small. The boy stared at the rifle near the rocker, the girl clung to her mother's skirts, and Elias closed the door against the storm's howl. He moved past them, throwing another log onto the fire. Sparks jumped high, shadows stretching across the low ceiling. She gave her name, Anika Holt. She did not say much else. She guided her children to the hearth, their small hands extending toward the blaze, as though thawing could happen in a single night. Elias busied himself with the pot on the stove. He did not ask questions, nor did he welcome them with more than the space itself. But he set 3 cups on the rough-hewn table. Coffee, bitter and black, steaming into the cold air between strangers. He placed one in front of the woman, another beside the girl. The boy sniffed at his, uncertain, until Anika touched his shoulder and nodded. No one spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, broken only by the wind clawing at the logs outside. Elias sat again in the rocker, the wood creaking as if in protest. His eyes found hers across the room. There was steel in that look, though weariness dulled its shine. She had not come here with begging hands, only with an unyielding bargain and a quiet desperation he knew too well. The children leaned against her, drifting toward sleep as warmth began to seep into their bones. Anika adjusted the shawl over their shoulders, her motions tender and deliberate. Elias watched without meaning to. Something in that sight unsettled him, the shape of a family within his cabin, where only his loneliness had lived for years. He leaned back, shadows cutting across his scarred features, and fixed his eyes on the fire. The steam from the coffee curled upward, thin and fragile, like a bridge no one dared to cross. The night wore on. Snow pressed against the walls, but inside there was only the uneasy company of strangers forced beneath one roof. Elias told himself he had done nothing more than keep them from freezing. Yet when his gaze slid once more to Anika, her hand resting protectively over her daughter's hair, her eyes still wary but unbroken, he felt the first stirrings of something heavier than obligation. Loneliness, he realized, was easier than trust. But easier had never meant better. The days crept by in a hush, each hour stitched together by the chores that kept the cabin breathing. Elias rose before the sun, pulling on his boots, his breath steaming in the pre-dawn chill as he stepped into the yard. The world outside was white and brittle, the fences groaning under snow, the cattle huddled tight against the cold. His axe struck the woodpile, steady and measured, each blow echoing across the hollow like a drumbeat against silence. Inside, Anika kept to the hearth. The smell of boiling beans or coarse bread sometimes drifted through the cabin, softening its edges. Her hands were always in motion, stirring, mending, brushing her children's hair smooth with her fingers when they grew restless. Elias heard her hum, low and almost unwilling, as if memory pushed the notes out of her throat. It unsettled him more than the storm winds. They spoke little. A nod when he left, a murmur when she handed him food, nothing more. Yet the silence pressed thick between them, heavy with things neither dared speak. Elias often found himself staring into the fire, and with it, into memory, a woman once standing in the same light, her shawl bright with color, her laughter filling the rafters. She had walked out one spring morning without a backward glance, taking the warmth with her. Since then, he had wrapped himself in solitude, convincing himself it was enough. Anika carried her own shadows. Sometimes at night, when the shutters rattled and the fire burned low, Elias caught her face lit in brief flame, eyes distant, lips pressed tight. She dreamed of a man long buried, his voice already fading to something faint and unreliable, like an echo carried on the wind. Her hands would clutch at her shawl as though it were his coat, only to fall still again when her children stirred. The nights were the hardest. Elias lay on his bed, the mattress creaking with his weight, while the widow curled on a pallet near her children. Some nights he dozed in the rocker instead, unwilling to leave her the weight of watchfulness. The wind at the windows made the cabin shiver, and in those restless hours, both lay awake, haunted not by what was present but by all that had been lost. Yet even in silence, small things began to shift. The girl, with wide eyes too old for her years, left something on his workbench, a braid of twine, uneven but deliberate. Elias turned it over in his palm, the rough strands tugging against his skin like a question he could not answer. The boy followed him outside one morning, his small boots sinking deep into snow, saying nothing, only watching Elias mend a fence line. He offered no help, only presence, which was somehow heavier. Symbols of trust bloomed like frost patterns on glass, fragile, temporary, yet undeniably there. Elias found himself setting aside an extra strip of jerky for the boy, or repairing a loose button on the girl's coat without being asked. These were not gestures of affection, he would admit, but habits he could not seem to stop. Still, he avoided Anika's eyes. When their paths crossed near the table or hearth, he busied himself with wood, tools, anything to keep from meeting that gaze. For in her silence he saw the shape of his own grief, reflected back too clearly. If he looked too long, he feared he would drown in it. So the cabin breathed with them, 3 survivors and 1 man locked inside his own walls. Their silences served them as both refuge and prison, a place to hide, but never to live. And yet, like snow melting slow into the earth, something beneath it all whispered of change. The storm fell sudden and merciless, rolling in from the north with a roar that buried the valley beneath white. The cabin walls moaned under its weight, every seam leaking a draught sharp as a knife. Elias had seen blizzards before, but the violence of this one left even him uneasy. He stacked wood by the hearth in high piles, rationed flour with a stern hand, and spoke little as the wind screamed at the shutters. The children clung to their mother, their thin forms tucked close as the storm rattled the roof. Anika's face held steady, though her eyes followed Elias as he paced, measuring each log he burned as though it were the last. Supper dwindled to beans and a crust of bread. The fire, though fed, could not soften the edges of the cold that pressed through every crack. It was in the heart of that storm, when the sky was nothing but shifting white, that Elias heard the sound, faint at first, like a groan against the wind. Then again, the ragged cry of a horse laboring through drifts. He moved to the window slit, his eyes narrowing, hand falling instinctively to the rifle near his rocker. Out of the snow came a rider, swaying, nearly falling, until horse and man lurched into the yard. By the time Elias wrenched open the door, the figure had half slid from the saddle. An Apache, his skin raw with frost, blood dark across his sleeve. He crumpled into the snow, his breath steaming weak and shallow. Elias raised the rifle, instincts hard as stone. He had known raids, known men burned out of their homes. Trust was not something he carried. Anika's voice cut through the howl of the blizzard. "He will die if you leave him there." Elias did not answer. The rifle stayed level, his heart pounding with old scars. The man's eyes flickered open, dark and unfocused, as if aware of both danger and mercy hanging by a thread. Anika's gaze did not waver. She had stood once on another threshold, begging for shelter. That memory burned in her eyes now. "Please," she said, her tone not pleading but firm, a command born of survival. Elias lowered the rifle. He cursed under his breath, stepped forward, and with a grunt pulled the wounded man inside. Snow spilled across the floor as he dragged him toward the fire. The cabin seemed to shrink again, for walls too narrow for such company. The children huddled close, their eyes wide. Elias dropped the stranger onto a blanket near the hearth, stripping away the ice-caked cloak. Beneath it, blood seeped from a gash along his arm, angry and swollen. The man's lips moved faintly, a word in a tongue Elias did not know. Anika knelt without hesitation. She pressed cloth to the wound, her fingers sure despite the tremor in her breath. Elias stood over them, rifle still in hand, unable to look away. The children crept nearer, their small hands offering the stranger water in a tin cup. He drank with difficulty, eyes closing in brief relief. Innocence bridged what hardened years could not, no fear, only the instinct to give. The storm raged against the cabin, rattling every seam, but inside, a different storm brewed. Elias kept his distance, leaning on the rifle as though it were the only thing holding him upright. He distrusted what lay at his hearth. Yet as the firelight played across Anika's face, he saw the way she tended both her children and this stranger with equal care, her shawl falling open to shield whoever needed warmth. Shame struck him, sharp as cold air. Where he carried suspicion like armor, she carried compassion like a weapon against despair. He envied it, and feared it. Hours passed in that uneasy stillness. The fire spat, snow battered, and inside the cabin 4 souls lingered at the edge of trust. Elias's hand stayed close to the rifle, but in the corner of his chest, something softer stirred. Walls, he realized, might keep men alive, but firelight shared had its own kind of power. The storm did not ease so quickly as Elias had hoped. Snow piled high against the door, and each morning began with the same ritual of forcing it open, shoveling a path just wide enough to fetch wood from the pile. The days blurred into one another, the walls of the cabin pressing close as though they too longed to breathe. Food was counted and halved, beans stretched with melted snow, bread baked thin and hard. Elias cut the firewood with careful measure, never wasting more than was needed, his axe cracking sharp through the brittle air. Inside, the fire never ceased, its glow the only barrier between them and the frost that gnawed at the windows. 4 adults and 2 children filled the space meant for one. Silence was constant, but not empty, it hummed with unspoken grudges and watchful eyes. Elias and the Apache, Koa, measured one another with every glance. Elias caught the man's gaze across the room, hard and unwavering, as though each saw in the other a threat that could not be ignored. Neither spoke much, but their silence struck sparks, a rifle's hammer drawn back but never falling. Between them, Anika moved like the steady flame of the hearth. Her shawl passed from shoulders to shoulders, settling on whichever child shivered most, or across the wounded man when his fever spiked. She poured the rationed coffee, steady hands never faltering, and sang lullabies so softly the children slept though the storm raged outside. Her voice threaded through the cabin like a balm, pulling the sharp edges of mistrust into something almost bearable. Elias found himself watching her more often than he meant to. He saw strength not as frailty but as defiance against despair. She met the storm with gentleness, and yet that gentleness was the strongest resistance he had ever known. At night, when the children slept and the fire burned low, Elias sometimes lingered in his rocker, listening to the faint hum of her voice. She would sit near the embers, mending small garments or simply staring into the glow. Strands of dark hair slipped free from her braid, falling loose across her cheek, catching the firelight like threads of copper. Once, while gathering more blankets from her trunk, he caught sight of something folded beneath, the faint shimmer of a wedding dress. He looked away quickly, ashamed to have seen it, but the image stayed with him. It spoke of vows left unfinished, of a life once promised but never carried to its end. Koa recovered slowly, his silence steady as stone. His dark eyes followed every motion in the cabin, and though Elias's hand still drifted toward his rifle at times, the man had done nothing but accept the food and water offered. One evening, after Anika tended his arm with fresh bandages, Koa spoke. The words were soft, in his own tongue, but his tone carried reverence, something like gratitude wrapped in prayer. Elias did not understand the language, yet the meaning pressed clear. It stirred something sharp in him, a pang that hollowed his chest. He had never spoken such words to her, though she had carried his house with quiet strength since the night she entered. He watched the way her eyes softened in reply, not in longing, but in recognition of simple humanity. That tenderness unsettled him more than mistrust ever had. The snowbound days grew longer still. The children learned to play in silence, carving shapes in the frost on the window, stacking bits of wood like tiny forts. The storm outside showed no mercy, but within the cabin, the true storm was the closeness of souls who could not escape one another. Elias knew then that he was not merely sheltering strangers. The cabin was no longer his alone, and the walls of silence he had built for years began to crack under the weight of their presence. In the firelight, watching Anika's shawl drape across shoulders that were not his own, he realized he was being forced to reckon with what he had refused to feel, that belonging was as dangerous as it was necessary. When the storm finally broke, it left the world hushed and sharp, the land buried deep beneath a crust of glittering snow. The sky cleared with brittle light, the kind that revealed everything and forgave nothing. For a day there was peace, the silence almost a relief after so many weeks bound in close quarters. But silence in winter often came before something worse. The riders came at dusk, their figures black against the pale horizon. Elias saw them first, a dark line moving across the snowfield, too many for travelers, too purposeful for neighbors. Raiders, men hardened by hunger and greed, sweeping homesteads like carrion birds. His heart clenched with a familiar bitterness. He reached for the rifle leaning by the door, and for once Koa moved in step with him, no words needed. The knock of hooves grew louder, circling the yard. Anika pulled her children close, her shawl wrapped around them like a shield, the edge of her late husband's fabric catching the firelight. The children pressed their faces against her skirts, their breaths quick, eyes wide. She did not cry out. She stood as firm as the door itself. Gunfire cracked, shattering the frozen stillness. Elias and Koa returned fire, their rifles echoing sharp against the mountainside. The cabin shook under the chaos, the once cramped walls now turned to fortress. Smoke filled the air, mingling with firelight and powder until breath itself seemed to burn. Shadows of men flashed through the windows, the scrape of boots against the porch boards. Elias fought with a fury born of years locked away, each shot deliberate, each motion carrying the weight of more than survival. Beside him, Koa moved swift and sure, his bow drawn when bullets ran thin, arrows hissing into the snow. 2 men fell near the barn, another slumped against the fence. But the fight did not pass without cost. A shot cracked through the window, and Elias staggered, heat searing his shoulder. He dropped back by the fire, teeth clenched, rifle slipping from his grip. The room spun, red and black edging his vision. He heard the children cry out, the sound raw and unguarded, cutting deeper than the wound itself. Anika was there in an instant, dropping to her knees. She pressed her hands against him, not as one desperate to keep a bargain, but as a woman who had chosen. Her shawl, the very one she had used to guard her children, she tore from her shoulders and bound tight across his wound. Her eyes burned into his, fierce and unyielding. "You are worth more than this silence," she whispered, her voice breaking yet steady. "More than the losses that hold you." Her words pierced deeper than any bullet. He saw in them no pity, no bargain, only truth. His body weakened, but something within him caught fire. It was not the blaze of battle, nor the ache of pain. It was belonging, fierce and terrifying, ignited in a place long thought dead. The children clung to him, their small hands at his sleeve, no longer treating him as stranger. They held him as though he were already something nearer to fatherhood, and he let them, too weak to resist, too moved to want to. The boy pressed his forehead against Elias's uninjured arm, the girl's braid brushing his cheek as she leaned close. Outside, the fight faded. Koa's shadow moved in the doorway, blooded but unbroken, his figure silhouetted against the snow where raiders lay scattered. The danger had passed, but inside the cabin, another battle had been won. The walls Elias had built around himself cracked and falling under the weight of need and love. He lay back against the hearthstones, breath ragged, Anika's shawl holding his wound. The fire threw its light across them all, woman, children, stranger, and himself, bound not by bargain but by choice, by the desperate grace of survival. For the first time in years, Elias did not feel like a man abandoned. He felt, even through pain, like a man who was needed. The night after the fight was still, almost reverent. The snow lay in drifts about the cabin, dark with blood where the raiders had fallen, yet the land itself seemed hushed, as if winter had closed its mouth around the violence. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and powder, the walls bearing scars from bullets that had torn through timber. The fire burned steady, its glow softer now, less a shield and more a comfort. Elias sat propped against the hearth, his shoulder bound with strips of Anika's shawl. Pain throbbed with each breath, but it was a pain that reminded him he was alive. The children, exhausted from terror and relief, slept piled together beneath quilts. Anika dozed lightly near them, her head bowed, hands still stained faintly with his blood. At first light, Koa prepared to leave. His wound, though deep, had mended enough for him to ride. He said little, as was his way, but when Elias offered him a nod, something nearer respect than before, the man paused. From the pouch at his side, he withdrew a single eagle feather, smooth and strong, and placed it on the table. No words were spoken, but the meaning lay heavy between them. Survival shared, firelight held in common, a bond no longer divided by mistrust. Then he stepped out into the pale dawn, his figure swallowed by the white horizon. In the days that followed, the cabin returned to its rhythm, though nothing was as it had been. Elias sat often on the porch, his wounded arm held close, watching as the children tumbled in the snow. Their laughter rang high, startling him with its brightness, for it had been years since he had heard such a sound near his home. Where once only wind had carried across the yard, now it was the shouts and games of youth, weaving life back into the hollow. Anika joined him one evening, shawl wrapped about her shoulders, her breath curling in the twilight. She did not speak of bargains as she had on the night she first arrived. She did not need to. Her presence beside him, the way her eyes rested on his face, steady and unflinching, was vow enough. Elias did not reach for her hand, yet their silence carried more weight than any promise spoken aloud. When strength returned to him, they rode into town together. Elias on his horse, Anika behind him with the children pressed close, their shawls wrapped tight against the wind. The road stretched white and long, but no longer lonely. Folks turned to watch as they passed, and though some eyes lingered with questions, Elias felt no need to answer. His world was no longer measured by the gossip of others, but by the warmth of the figures riding with him. Back at the cabin, the old rocker swayed empty on the porch, creaking softly in the winter air. For years it had been the seat of a man waiting for nothing, counting silence, measuring loss. Now it rocked with no burden, for Elias no longer sat alone within its worn curve. He had something better than waiting. He had firelight in his chest, the weight of belonging beside him, and laughter where once there had been only wind. The land would still be hard, the winters long, the scars unhealed. Yet for the first time in years, Elias felt them not as chains, but as reminders of what could be endured together. Loneliness had been easier, yes, but easier had never meant living. And as the snow fell soft across the homestead, Elias Mercer knew he had finally chosen life over silence.